I'm really delighted to be with you here tonight down there in Christchurch, and coming from the North Island and the weather events we've had. It's quite a strange and unusual feeling around climate change, the way in which certain things hit certain communities harder than others. So really thank you, Dave, for acknowledging the events that have been happening up here. So I'm going to share my screen now, and there are a few interactive elements in this. The angle I've got is of people on the left-hand side, so I won't be seeing exactly what you're doing, but I hope you'll play along a bit, because I think that makes it more fun and gets you thinking about the issues that I will be discussing. So I'm just going to share my screen now, and just in case anybody asks, Dave, I'm very willing to email you all these slides and make them available to anyone who's interested in them. So one of the things I want to make clear from the very beginning, that my whole gig is about inspiring people to take action. This is really a talk for activists or want to be activists or community organisers. It's not about the things you do to make it easy for people to do the right thing, although that's often a big part of being an activist. It's really about inspiring people to join in the core of these movements. So just so that you understand where I'm coming from. And I did want to sort of get this little bit over and done with at the very beginning, which is that there are 2 books and a website, and in particular, that free online manual with exercises from the books is something that you may want to check out afterwards, because a lot of what I'm going to do with you is actually in that manual if you wanted to do it with other community groups. So that's a really good resource for you to follow up with if you're interested. So I want to start with one just interactive exercise from the very beginning, which is to think about what you value most deeply. Now, just to give you a little bit more language to try and sort of get in the mood of what I'm talking about now, these are things that you may consider sacred, if that word resonates for you, precious, special, things that are of value for their own sake, that which makes the world truly alive. Now, these deepest values I'm talking about can be in any dimension. So we could be talking about emotions, relationships, part of the natural world, qualities or objects. The kind of words that might come to mind might be general things, abstract ideas that apply to anyone, or super specific things about your life that just sort of immediately come up for you. Now, this is going to be slightly chaotic, but what I'd like you to do in no particular order is just say 1 or 2 things to the neighbour on your right and the neighbour on your left. And I'll just give you a minute to exchange what values come to mind when you are given this exercise. Anyway, so I've asked this question of thousands of people, both in Aotearoa and overseas. 1,080 were part of a formal research study, and we collected their values in workshops and talks by people stating them out loud, writing them down on pieces of paper, and constructed from that a categorization and a word cloud that I'm going to show you in a minute, which represents the values that people said. So the bigger the word on the cloud, the more people said at least one word associated with this value. And as well as looking at those words right now, just for a moment, think about how you feel, and we'll come back to this, how you feel imagining that those are the things that people hold most dear. Love, family, happiness, friendship, nature, the ocean, compassion, helping others, children, my children, cooperation, delicious food, creativity, tolerance, mountains and rivers, artistic expression. Now, the word cloud's one way to sort of understand and think about those values, but another way is to think about them as falling into 4 major categories. So if I was there in person, what I would have got you to do is actually write 3 values on a post-it note, separate post-it notes. And then I'd have put up this quadrant and I'd have got you to stick your post-it notes in the quadrant that you think applies for each of the values. And almost certainly, because it always comes out this way, the biggest quadrant ends up being human relationships, because the thing that for the most people, most of the time, of course, there's exceptions always, it's those that seem to spring immediately to mind. So if we look at the word cloud, it's things like relationships, friendship, family, children, civil society, empathy, connection, communication, those kinds of ideas which are essentially about human relationships that people often come to first. Now, a second big category is human expression. We distinguish this from human relationships because it's more about the things that feel like they're generated by you. So if we look at the word cloud, all the emotions would go into there, as well as qualities about people. So things like honesty, as well as learning, growth, and creativity. So artistic expression, we would have categorized as human expression. There's lots of overlap, something like laughter, we would have put as human expression, but of course that's so often about relationships as well. Humor, freedom, those kinds of words, knowledge, learning, and so on. Now, another big category, probably quite big for you, I suspect you'll have exchanged some words related to this because it's a group which has the environment top of mind, is the natural world. So that's your trees, your mountains, your oceans, and so on. In some groups, that's pretty small, to be honest, groups that aren't so focused on the natural world, which is an interesting thing we can talk about later in the questions, if you like. And then the fourth one is the whole. So complexity and spirituality, there's words on the clouds like connection to the whole, appreciation and wonder, the universe, spirituality and transcendence. Those kinds of words would be categorized in this way. In secular societies like ours, which is not to say, of course, there aren't many sort of religious groups within society, but when the public culture is largely secular, that quadrant is actually fairly small here and when I do this exercise with people. But so that's kind of what matters most. And I'm asking you to slightly take this on faith, not because we can't sort of question it and get into whether these values are really what people hold most deeply, but because a lot of my argument is, or a lot of what I'm trying to say today, is not just about what people really hold most deeply, but also what happens when we assume that this is what people hold most deeply, as opposed to when we assume they hold other kinds of values most deeply. So we'll get on to that soon. So I've got sort of scattered throughout here 3 key messages. The first one is that almost all people and cultures value relationships that ensure cooperation and protection of the natural world. And it's a matter of making these values salient and bringing them into our practice. As I said, it's not saying they're the only values people hold, but you simply cannot survive as a culture, as a group of people, if you don't have methods of ensuring cooperation and protection of the natural world, at least to a degree. So as I said before, I sort of invited you to really think about how you feel in response to seeing this word cloud. And with 1 in 4 workshops that I did where I was asking people to generate these values, I also got them to say what they thought was of deepest value. And then I showed them the word cloud that I showed you, an earlier version, but basically the same thing, and got them to write down how they felt seeing this word cloud. And this was 128 people in total. And then we coded these to look for the themes that were coming out in people's feelings. And that's just the word cloud again. So these were the responses. These were the top ones are the 3 core themes that came from their responses. Sense of belonging to a human community with shared values, feeling safe and reassured, and being uplifted and filled with hope. Now, there were also some responses, a minority, but they were there, that said, who are these people? I don't trust this. I don't believe this. You only talk to greeny lefty types, didn't you? And another sort of minority response, but there was, I believe in this stuff, but why am I failing to live up to it? Was another thing that came through a bit. But I put those in grey because they were sort of minority responses rather than these big core themes. And what I want to suggest is that word cloud, or if you think more broadly or generally, feeling that we have values that are pro-social, about caring for what we have in common, that are orienting us to the common good, is essentially what we can call a tale of joy. And this concept, a tale of joy, was coined by the community psychologist Julian Rappaport, who talked about two different types of tales that we're exposed to, tales of joy and tales of terror. I'll get on to the latter soon. And tales of joy have these two really important components. One is that we feel good. So as you can see from those themes, safe, reassured, filled with hope, all positive emotions. But perhaps just as, maybe more importantly, they invite us to work together. So a tale of joy is essentially saying to people, you are part of a community you can trust. People have got your back, if you like. There's the opportunity to move forward as a group. So that sense of being uplifted, belonging, and so on. Now, I'm going to just take a slight segue here and talk about our stage 1 psychology classes. And we have 600 students doing first year psychology twice a year. And one semester, so for one group of those 600, they all have labs. They're divided into lab groups as well as lectures. And there are 20 lab groups, so about 30 students in one of these lab groups. And what we did for this experiment that I'll talk you through now is that we randomly divided the labs into two conditions, condition 1 and condition 2. Now, the labs take place in front of computer screens, which I think is a bit weird, but that's the way it is, and it was useful for this exercise. So we've got these students there with computers, and they're with a graduate assistant who's explaining to them what they're going to be doing in the lab. Now, for all 20 lab groups, the graduate assistant explained that we were going to be talking about values, asked them to write 3 of their deepest values into a computer program, describe them just the way I described them to you, value for their own sake, makes the world truly alive, etc. That was written on the screen, but also described verbally. So the students in both groups wrote these values into the computer, and we analysed those, and they came out almost exactly the same as the previous word cloud, certainly the same general gist. Now, the graduate student for condition 1 students, so 10 of those labs, then said to them, okay, thank you for that. You can now click on to the next screen, which shows the responses of 1,080 people that we asked this question previously, and it showed them the word cloud. And then asked them to write into the computer how they feel, imagining that this is what other people value most deeply. And what we found as a result of that was that students basically wrote concepts that pretty much fitted the same sort of themes that have been set by the community group. So there's a bit of nuance, but I'm not going to go into that tonight because I don't think that's so important. But basically, they felt that sense of belonging, safety and reassurance, and filled with hope. And they had that, what we could call a tale of joy. Now, remember, there were 10 other groups in condition 2. Once those groups had put their values into the computer screen, the graduate assistant said to them, we've asked 1,080 people here in New Zealand what they consider of deepest value, and you may click on to the next screen and see what they said. And the next screen showed that. I want you to imagine for a minute that you've just typed in love, birds, nature, expression, freedom, happiness, and you're told that this is what other people value most deeply. Well, I'll show you now some of the themes that came out of the responses of the students. The dominance of money and materialism made me think how materialistic people can be in society. Critique, cared about themselves, gold diggers. I think it's closed-minded to say money is of infinite value. By the way, that word infinite value is the sort of title given to these values when we ask them. Shocked or confused, shocked that people value material things more than real connections. I feel strange. Negative emotions, upset that money and power are so high, sad, disappointed, a bit disgusted. It's annoying me. Recognition of the importance of the values shown. I'm sad that money and material things were the most important to people, but it's understandable. Not surprised money was the biggest common value to others. And then disconnection. It was nothing like I answered. And this one to me sort of caps it up, really captures it. Feel slightly confused as none of my listed things were on the cloud of common things. Considered whether I'd interpreted the question wrong. And I don't know, how many of you go through life thinking, have I interpreted the question wrong? I mean, that's a comment I really resonate with, because there's this weird disconnected sense that surely this can't be right. But is it me that's just out of kilter with what's going on around me? Now, this essentially then is your tale of terror. And it's a tale of terror for the opposing reasons. The other is a tale of joy, which is that it makes you feel bad. So you've got these sad, disappointed, disgusted feelings, but also, really importantly, it splits people apart. So you can, if you look at those responses again, there is nothing in that is going to inspire people to action, as opposed to those kinds of responses. Now, unfortunately, the environmental movement can be quite good at telling tales of terror. They're motivated, of course, to get people concerned and moving, but they can have this really unfortunate side effect of making people isolated, scared, and that others can't be trusted. And we'll sort of be elaborating on that throughout and can come back to it again at the end. So this key message too then is that a tale of joy involves sensing that other people are somehow familiar rather than alien, that we're in life together rather than each looking after our own interests. If we tell tales of joy, we invite people to participate in activities that benefit us all. On the other hand, if we tell tales of terror, we risk people feeling isolated and unwilling to work together. Just in case you were worried, the next week in lectures, we debriefed the entire class and showed them what was the correct word cloud. And I could swear you could see those students that were in the tutorials that got the money cloud just bursting with relief that it wasn't true after all. So I'm going to move on to the sort of second part of this. Just keep those questions flowing, but we'll save them to the end. And this is about people as having emotions, and that these emotions mattering. Now, they matter in their own sake, for their own sake, of course, emotions. And on the word cloud were a lot of different emotions that matter for their own sake, happiness being an obvious one. But they also matter in terms of climate change action and communication, because people don't always show their emotions, but what people are willing to do and how people are responding usually is, or very often is, driven by very strong emotional undercurrents that may or may not be visible. So I think it's really important to be thinking constantly about what you may be generating or we may be generating in our communications. Now, I've got a picture here of a father and a daughter. It's a beautiful picture, probably feeling something like joy or happiness, and we'll come back to positive emotions soon. But I want to start by giving a breakdown of what psychologists talk about in terms of the three components that there are to emotions. Now, I'm saying that as if psychologists have one view. which is, of course, not the case. So I'm just giving sort of one version of how psychologists look at this. Now, these three components are feelings, or what's happening in the body, thoughts and images, so what's going through the mind, and action tendencies, what emotions make us want to do. So if we look at this father and daughter, feelings, what's going on in the body, you can see their bodies are sort of relaxed but alert. The non-verbal expressions on their faces show that joy. You can also see that they're looking outwards, and that seems to be part of what they're doing in response to or helping to generate this emotion. Thoughts and images, well, they're in a beautiful place. They're looking at each other, probably imagining each other. Maybe the daughter there has spied a playground or some seagulls she wants to run after. And these things are going through their minds. What do they want to do? Well, as is typical of positive emotions, they want to explore, they want to play, they want to be together. Positive emotions, as I'll talk about later, tend to sort of expand our horizons. However, having done that little tale of joy, we're going to move a little bit into talking about negative emotions and the effect of those. So using that same breakdown of feelings, what's going on in the body, thoughts and images, and action tendencies, negative emotions tend to lead to a tense and agitated or lethargic body position. You'll know this very well yourself. Thoughts that are often going through our mind is a focus on the issue, so it's sort of an image of the problem, and a desire to solve the problem. That's kind of, how do I solve this? How do I solve this? Is kind of flicking through our minds very, very rapidly. And the action tendency in how do I put this? When an emotion first comes up is to try and solve the problem quickly and directly. So negative emotions have that survival value of making us flee, making us attack, making us do various other things that can be quite useful in that moment. Now, if, for example, you've got a spot on your arm that you're worried about, you become extremely tense, you're thinking about it all the time. If you go to the doctor and get it looked at, you've taken the most useful action, that emotion has done its job, the doctor does whatever, and you move on. Unfortunately, as we all know, when we're talking about things like climate change, and we feel all sorts of different things, and we're going to be getting into that soon, we have this tense, agitated, and often lethargic body, and variations of that. I'll talk about a study on young people. Thoughts, a lot of focus on the details of the issue, a really intense desire to solve the problem, but there's no way to solve the problem quickly and directly, at least not for the likes of you and me. And so what can tend to happen with this is partly chronic anxiety, which I'll get to, but also sometimes denial, because when negative emotions are very unpleasant and we can't get rid of the thing generating the emotion, if you like, the next best strategy is to get rid of the emotion itself. And that can mean underplaying the issue, trying not to think about it, and all of those kinds of reactions. So that's pretty problematic when it comes to climate change. I think one has to be very, very careful about generating these negative emotions, but we can discuss this if you'd like to later. So here's another little interactive exercise. I want you to think now about the emotion of fear. And I briefly mentioned the fight-flight kind of response in relation to threat just then. So fear, in this sense, is the flight reaction in relation to threat. And fear tends to result in self-preservation, because at its core of it is a sense that you or your loved ones are deeply threatened. And in order to protect you and them, you sort of need to get out of it, basically, in one way or another. So I want you to, we're going to sort of have hands up in a minute. I want you to look at those three images, the storm surge, the polar bear, and the people walking across the desert. I want you to think, for you personally, so there's no kind of correct answers here, which one generates the most fear if you get into that and imagine that? Okay, so hands up for storm surge. Hands up for polar bear. Hands up for people in the desert. Okay, great. So from what I could see, the majority went the same way that I do, which is a storm surge. And you, again, because I'm not there, I'm not going to ask you why. I'm just going to tell you why I picked it. Because it's the most threatening to me. I live 7 meters above sea level in Auckland, and when I get anxious, the kind of climate information that just triggers a fear reaction in me is around sea level rise, because I am worried about it. And you know what? When I get that fear reaction in relation to sea level rise, ironically, actually, our suburb wasn't badly affected by the cyclone for various other things to do with its geography. But anyway, do you know what I want to do? I don't want to go out there and fight for climate change. I want to sell this house and move to higher ground. Like, it's that selfish, look after me and mine first reaction. Okay, we'll come back to those in a minute. So again, just to reiterate with fear, it's good when you can take immediate action. Here's Sam from the Game of Thrones, who's just seen White Walkers or the Army of the Dead or something that'll turn him into a zombie if they get hold of him. Quite correctly, he's run away and is hiding behind a rock. Okay, so let's talk a bit now about anger. That, by the way, is Daenerys Targaryen, whose dragons are about to set the city on fire behind her because she's extremely angry and does the angry face really well. Fight or flight, anger is the fight response, and we actually have a way better example than Daenerys, which is Greta Thunberg. She's the poster child of anger, and you can see her body tense, leaning forward, and her message is basically one of, you get your act together, you do this. So anger is a sense of injustice. It's a requirement for others to sort of do things. And it can be a bit of a tearing down, if you like. Now, what's interesting about anger in relation to research on social movements is that studies have shown that, and I don't really need to tell you that studies have shown this, you know it, anger is strongly present in social movements and definitely helps motivate collective action. But it's also got this huge downside, particularly when we're talking about building a new way of living, a new sort of community, new ways of looking after each other, which is what we're going to need to do with climate change, because it's based on these us-them divisions. Anger's almost always anger at the other who has annoyed you because they're wrong, you're right. And so there's this, can fuel violent cycles of attack and revenge. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient as an emotion, I think. So just to summarize those two: fear, withdrawal, self-protection, paralysis; anger, tearing down, demanding action of others. So let's play this game again. And I'll just describe what I mean by sadness this time. So sadness is a little bit apart from the flight or fight. It's a less agitated emotion. It's a more diffuse emotion, and it's less directly related to an immediate threat to you and your loved ones. It can, of course, be very strongly related to grief, which can be a very personal loss as well. But I'm thinking here of it as a more diffuse, generalized thing. So playing the game again, the most sadness, storm surge, polar bear, people in the desert. Yep. Again, obviously, we're sort of quite linked, because I'd vote polar bear. And I have to say again, the reason I think I'd vote polar bear is because the polar bear looks so sad itself. And we can see the face of the polar bear. And there's just something horribly wrong about that idea and that image, maybe because polar bears, we're told a lot about them and we all know sort of what happens. They, swimming and not being able to find food and all of that kind of thing. People in the desert, interestingly, we can't see their faces. So possibly for many of us, that makes them just a little bit less triggering. And of course, the houses don't really have any sort of living beings in them. So it's actually just quite interesting to look at images and think about the particular kinds of reactions. Now, interestingly, there's not a lot of research on sadness in relation to environmental issues, but one study did show that out of all the emotions generated in people are sort of deliberately shown messaging in order to generate particular kinds of emotions, that sadness inspired the greatest contribution to environmental causes. And my sort of theory on that is because it's got this much more diffuse, less self-protective element, which maybe allows us to connect with other people and be motivated in that kind of way. So I want to talk a little bit now about eco-anxiety, which is a combination of a lot of these different emotions, and we'll get on to positive emotions. Now, the American Psychological Association has defined eco-anxiety as chronic, and I've bolded chronic, fear of environmental doom. So fear is often, the way it's talked about as a intense reaction that doesn't maintain itself for very long, whereas anxiety is this, chronic underlying thing which can just go on and on and on and on and on at you. And interestingly, it's often been talked about, eco-anxiety, as a form of pre-traumatic stress. So as human beings, again, as you well know, bad things happen to us, and that causes all sorts of effects. But we're also able to imagine bad things happening to us, and that also causes powerful psychological effects. So many of these tales of terror that the media is full of, which I'll talk about in just a second, are fueling our minds to anticipate terrible things, and in particular with young people, potentially making them pretty miserable as a result. So I'm going to flick through this fairly carefully. You're all really familiar with these kinds of communications. This is just one I use in teaching. So I pulled it out, and I get students to go through and point out all the sort of strong emotive words that are triggering anger, sadness, fear, and those kinds of reactions. And you can see that I've just put in, highlight in yellow some of those. So there's this overall tone that we're at the very worst time in history. Words like spectre, man-made climate change, words like ominously, grips, this kind of language. Often these beautiful apocalyptic pictures which appeal greatly to young adults and teenagers. That's a rather beautiful picture. But, a whole swath of the southern United States, generational event, deepening climate change-induced droughts, and so on. You're all familiar with this kind of language. And part of this sort of generation of these dreadful events is about the planet itself, but a lot of it is about how useless politicians are. And that's this kind of crazy, scary, sort of destabilizing part of this apocalyptic narrative. So again, these are just things I use with students, some headlines pulled from various sites. Don't bet on the UN to fix climate change. It's failed for 30 years. Why politicians fail to tackle climate change. It's the politics, stupid. And then the last one, which really I find really problematic. Auckland transport overhaul won't reduce emissions. So, you might well know we're sort of having an inner city rail link and all sorts of other things, spending billions of dollars. And then you see that. So there's this kind of apocalyptic double play that's going on. Planet's going to wreck and ruin, politicians are useless, and then on top of that is this sort of demand to face the truth. So I know, as you know, that there's a lot of talk about climate denial and that they're the baddies, and a sort of side effect of that is almost the assumption that unless you're constantly thinking worst case scenario, you're letting the side down somehow. I think that's become a rhetoric that often runs through environmental circles. So the kind of, just to go back to those three parts, what's going on. And I actually didn't put up the reference here, but there was a recent study published last year, maybe it was a year before now, but recently, which involved 1,000 young people from 10 different countries representing all continents, not New Zealand, but Australia was included. And they asked young people lots of questions about the climate and their concerns and if it was affecting their daily lives and so on. And these kinds of reactions were some of the things that they were reporting in relation to climate change. So the body, it wasn't broken down this way, but they were reporting feeling tense, agitated, so ready to spring into action, but also tired and lethargic. A lot of young people reporting that they sort of couldn't be bothered doing things. Thoughts and images, a lot of them very, very focused on government incompetence, their own government being incompetent and not taking enough action, and the idea of an insecure and chaotic future. So these are the kinds of images. And the action tendencies, well, one of the biggest was apathy, this kind of can't be bothered, tired and lethargic sort of response, impatience with other people, withdrawal from other people, inability to do normal tasks well, but support for climate change policy and taking part in the political process. So the thing I think that's really interesting about anxiety, and so often with these different things, is it's not all bad. It doesn't feel good, but it is vigilant. I mean, if you think about your personal anxieties, whatever it is that makes you the most worried, fear of the disease that your parent died of, that's one of mine, worry that your child won't get a job, it's another one of mine, picking out mine. If you think of your most personal anxieties, the sort of upside to them is that you do pay attention to them and you're sort of on top of them a bit. You're aware of that issue. It's not going to just slide by because you weren't paying attention. And so in relation to climate change, the good thing is that anxiety, if we train this generation of young people who are anxious, they're also going to be more ready to take to support climate change action policies, potentially to join groups if they can get beyond that sort of lethargic response. And so it's kind of a good thing at that level. I think this is a really complex, interesting issue. Anyway, so strong emotions about climate change, including worry, is related to strong support for climate change policy. And Hickman and associates have talked about this concept of practical anxiety, so twisting eco-anxiety on its head to talk about practical anxiety that encourages people to consider their behaviour and take action. So I'm kind of nearly at the end of the talky bit before we sort of start to move on to questions, but I want to talk just a little bit about positive emotions and we'll do one more exercise. So going back to this lovely picture again and remembering some of the things about the body in relation to positive emotions that are sort of opposing, if you like, the body's reaction to negative emotions. So relaxed, awake, and attention to sensory input is a big thing about positive emotions, because we're not narrowly focused on the one thing we're scared of or angry about or sad about. We actually notice what's happening in the environment around us. This is particularly important in social situations in terms of taking account of others, being interpersonally warm and skilled, inviting ideas and creativity and so on into the game that's happening. So thoughts, people are thinking when they're in positive states have been shown to think much more about what's possible. So if you put people into a negative state and then ask them to list what they might do over the next week, they generate fewer ideas than if you put people into a positive state and ask them what they might do over the next week. And psychologists have sort of talked about this as the way in which the mind in a positive state is more open to possibility, taking risks and so on, rather than focused on that particular threat that they need to deal with. Now, this can result in a sort of flitting mind, if you like, one that isn't focused, and that can be a bit of a problem. But it's not a rigid mind. It's one with movement in it. So the action tendencies of people in positive states, and I'm including things like happiness, joy, belonging, excitement, inspiration, all of those kinds of things, are to be creative. Again, the mind is open to new possibilities, so people are thinking of different things and willing to try things out. People are much more cooperative when they're in positive states. Again, if you sort of do a bit of thinking about yourself, when are you generous and giving and open to people? Is it when you feel dreadful, or is it when you feel calm and joyful and so on? And ironically, to some extent, people are more willing to change. So I think sometimes in environmentalism, we sort of have the image that if we just show them how bad it is and how badly they're behaving by, driving their cars and taking overseas trips and putting their rubbish in the landfill and getting disposable coffee cups and working for a big oil company and all the other things on our great list of sins. Not that I'm saying they're good things to do, but anyway, if we just sort of point this out, they'll change. But actually, it looks like people change when they're feeling sort of strong and able in themselves. And so affirming people for what they do and then bringing in possibilities for doing things differently, at least at a psychological level, seems to be more effective. This lack of focus, because you're feeling good and there's all these possibilities, can actually be an issue with positive emotions. And to get things done, one does have to be at least in a neutral mood some of the time, which, don't worry, it's not like we're all going to be happy all the time anyway. So I think we have very little risk that we'll be over happy. I don't know about your life. Anyway, so let's just move on to this idea of hope, because there's a lot of talk about hope. This is the last episode of the last season of Game of Thrones, where they finally vaguely got their act together. But what is hope? And we can't get too sort of caught up in language, because these are all just words we're putting on complex things. But it's interesting to think about hope's possibilities and limitations. And one thing I find useful is to categorize hope in two ways, crudely. So complacent hope is associated with denial. And complacent hope is when you basically are either underplaying the problem or assuming that other people will deal with it. And again, plenty of that going on with climate change. And quite frankly, I think sometimes the most adaptive response, if your life is just overwhelmed with things you have to do to keep your life and your family's life going, or you're doing a job that's just really, really demanding and so on. The second type is motivational hope. So this is what we're aiming at, because motivational hope is the kind of hope that encourages collective action. It's another way of saying a tale of joy, essentially. So what we're trying to aim at, I think, is a kind of hope that acknowledges the reality of the situation, but also tells a tale of joy at the same time. And I'm going to get you to do another sort of, just have a couple of minutes of talking amongst yourselves. And I don't know how many rows there are there. Dave, I'm going to get you to sort of vaguely allocate these jobs in a second. But what I've got here is the idea of a 12-year-old girl. Doesn't have to be a girl, but she's a girl in the picture. And she comes to you and she says, because of climate change, I might not get to be an adult. If I'm alive in 10 years, I won't have a job or anywhere to live, and I can never have children. Which I don't think is completely, I think lots of 12-year-olds are thinking these kinds of thoughts and sometimes expressing them. So Dave, what I'm sort of after is roughly just, it can be super rough, so it doesn't really need to be well organized, but you're going to be divided so that you're doing one of three tasks just with the personal couple of people around you. So Dave, we want sort of the first 2 rows or whatever it is to sort of work out a response to that 12-year-old that'll exacerbate her anxiety. Okay, so the first couple of rows or whatever, I'll get you to point them out in a minute. The second couple of rows, potentially whatever, to do complacent hope, a response like that. And the third, a couple of rows to think of a response that would generate motivational hope. And I'm going to give you about 3 minutes, I think, in groups to just brainstorm ideas along those lines. Great. I hope you got had a bit of fun there thinking about this one. And I'm just going to run over the answers I prepared in advance, just like a TV chef. And sorry that I can't sort of, with the interaction, easily hear yours. But these are just some of the ones I imagined. This is me, you know, a slightly younger, way more glamorous version of me responding here. So anxiety, you're right. We're in a terrible situation and nobody's doing anything about it. You should try and save the world. Do it now or all will be lost. And quite frankly, I don't think that's a million miles from what we're sometimes saying to our young people. I do hear people say, you know, people my age or whatever, say to, you know, a room full of teenagers, this is going to be your world. So it's up to you to think of solutions. And I'm thinking, please don't say that. Anyway, yeah. And then here's complacent hope. There are lots of adults concerned about climate change. They have it all under control. No need for you to worry because soon we will have the technology to solve these problems. And the third one, motivational hope. There are lots of people concerned about climate change. They're working very hard to find solutions all over the world. Scientists, engineers, teachers, community leaders are getting together. People have solved really hard problems before. Let's find a group you can join. So, you know, thinking about those, we've got a 12-year-old here, but how different are adults really in terms of what you want to generate? So I do want to just sort of, this is the last point really, is I think inviting hope involves stepping aside from your own fear as much as the truth you reveal. I've thought a lot about why some speakers are able to convey the same facts, if you like, in a way that terrifies me, and some convey the facts in a way that actually inspires me. And I think one of those things is that holding your own fear and not projecting it onto others. So it goes back to a full circle of those values. If at some level you are willing to take on faith that people are, for want of a better word, good, motivated to care for each other, that we can get through this, if that's your starting premise and you can sort of hold that really deeply, then I think what you say, no matter the content of it, it doesn't have that sort of edge of a tale of terror where people feel abandoned and lonely and what's the point about it all? Because there is a sense in which, you know, when I think about, I've got 3 children and 2 tiny little grandchildren. And if I think about the future for them, however it sounds, I want them to live with love. I really do. That's what I want for them most of all. I want them to live with love. And I think you don't get that without sort of assuming it. Like you have to look for it and you have to be in that space. And then when these awful things happen, because I think they probably will, to me, the critical thing is that we don't just all start attacking each other, actually. And I worry about that more than the physical stuff. Maybe because I'm a psychologist, but I'm not saying please fix the physical stuff, you engineers. No, that's the wrong game, isn't it? I'm supposed to be helping. Anyway, so just to finish then, the key message 3, don't worry too much, be happy most of the time. I'm not demanding any emotions, but I'm, I think about what you're doing at a social level and how you come across. So fear, anger, and fear, sadness, and anger focus attention. They're strongly present in environmental communications, but they're very, very powerful. So we need to be careful of their power. Eco-anxiety, chronic fear of environmental doom. Anxiety is vigilant, but should we induce it? Positive emotions in people inspire creativity, cooperation, and openness to change. And I think inviting hope involves stepping aside from your own fear.